Deuteronomy chapters 8 to 12 today, which continues the theme of Moses providing all this information in the form of a big speech. And also it's all very small points in rapid fire succession. Again, if you were writing this, you'd do it as bullet points almost, I think. Well, obviously Moses didn't, but that would seem like a reasonable way to present it, because there's a lot of stuff in a short space of time. It opens with Moses reminding the Israelites they need to do as they're told, and in return for doing all this they will get all the good stuff and all the promised land and all the rest of that. And he mentions that the time the Israelites spent in the desert, the 40 years coming from Egypt up to the promised land, that was intended by God to be a test of what is in their hearts, and would they keep God's commandments. It would seem therefore that had they just did as they were told in the first place, they wouldn't needed to have been going around in circles. But nevertheless, it is stated that this was intended as a test they presumably failed to some extent. It's not been impressive behaviour, is it? I mean, it's been quite clear, do this and you get that, and they've not done that at almost every turn. So it seems a deeply flawed civilization in that respect. But they've had all this extensive testing, and God seems to be satisfied that they don't need wiping out at the very least. But he does mention, there was a reference earlier to the Israelites being stiff-necked, basically stubborn, as I understand it. And God again makes his point that the Israelites are very, very stubborn. There's an odd phrase that pops up, and it's something I thought I'd heard my dad talk about years and years and years ago, but given Christians tend to talk about the New Testament, not the Old Testament, almost as if they view the Old Testament as something of an inconvenience, just because of what's in it. But yeah, I'm going to read it because obviously the high-tech thing. It's, man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. What? Yeah, I mean, obviously some metaphor going on there. But I guess that seemed to suggest the importance of the balance between spiritual and physical things. I mean, obviously you've got to eat or your body dies, but it seemed reasonable that humans do require some physical nourishment, but also some sort of spiritual pursuit, whatever that means to you. I mean, that doesn't have to mean spirits up in the skies and things, but just some sort of existential tackling of life, I guess, in some extent. But this would seem to allude to the fact that there needs to be some sort of balance in life. It's not just physical, it's not just spiritual, it is a bit of both. There's another part where Moses likens God disciplining the Israelites to a parent disciplining a child. I suppose that sort of seemed obvious in the sense that I think God naturally seems to fit into a sort of a slightly odd parental role in that respect. But I think maybe is that the first time that's been stated? I don't know, maybe not, but it stuck out as we are supposed to be looking at this as us being disciplined by someone who knows more about what's going on. So it's interesting. We'll keep an eye on that. There's a part that you could probably paraphrase as don't get too big for your boots. There's talk about if you've done really well at something, you've achieved a great thing, don't get all high and mighty about how great your achievement is and all the rest of it, because it's God who's given you the necessary means in order to have done that. That inevitably, I think, comes back to a question of fairness, or raises a question of fairness. And as I've said before, I don't think there's any sort of suggestion that life was going to be fair. But at the same time, where it isn't, it doesn't seem unreasonable to call that out and just like, that's a bit difficult. So someone who has achieved a lot, because God has given them a lot, even if it's as simple as able-bodied and intelligent, versus someone else who's not so bright or has some sort of disability. I mean, obviously, people in those two positions are going to have different results, for better or worse, on both sides, to be fair. But even so, it's still an element in that of, well, how come that person was given more to deal with than that one? And it's, yeah, I don't quite know what to do with that, but it's an interesting idea that it's a suggestion that all your virtues and all your skills and all your things that contribute to you achieving anything all come from God, so you can't take any credit. I don't really like that, how to say it. It's almost diminishing of responsibility, albeit I do think people where we are fortunate should be grateful for that good fortune and recognise it. Broadly here, lucky to have been born when we're born and where we were born for the most part. But yeah, I don't know, it's an interesting idea, but not quite comfortable with that one, so I have to keep an eye and see where that goes. There's a lot of stressing on the point that you mustn't forget God. Not forget in the literal sense, I think more in the sense of if you start taking great pride in all your material achievements and all the rest of it, and then you sort of forget that actually that did all come from God, then just say that God will destroy you. To what extent that means, I mean, obviously there's going to be some metaphorical elements to that, but again, that's clearly being stressed that that's something you need to keep an eye on. There's also a part where Moses makes the point that the Israelites are not being given the promised land because they are special and virtuous and righteous and all the rest of it. It's that the people who are already there are being kicked out because they are wicked. There's a really interesting point in that, I think, in that although it's a very sort of thin distinction in some ways, that distinction is in the fact that it still makes the point that the Israelites are not perfect. It's not saying to them, you're wonderful, have this land. It's saying you're still punks, but you're going to get this land because I'm driving out these people who are even worse. So it's very sort of reserved. Here you go, have your stuff. But there's a very odd turn of phrase at one point. It talks about the people needing to circumcise their hearts. What? No idea what that means. We'll just look out to see if that comes again. I've debated Googling it, but I'm not going to. I'm going to see if it comes up again, and otherwise skip on, because all the metaphor stuff, it's everywhere, so it's really difficult to know what to do with that. But yeah, we'll see if that comes up again, and then perhaps delve a bit deeper if it does. It makes the point again that God loves the foreigners residing among the Israelites. So I think the interesting thing for me in that is that it suggests that it's not just about God's favourite people, the Israelites, and everyone else is going to get wiped out, which was one of my discomforts earlier on. But it's just saying, you know, as long as you're doing the right thing, God is very happy with you, and you then have to in turn be good to these people as well. So it doesn't quite solve the problem on its own, but when you start to pull all the factors together, like the bad behaviour and the wickedness and what's going on with these other civilisations, the fact that if you are actually behaving and you're embracing God and all the rest of it, then God is quite happy. So yeah, I think that helps soften all of that, I think. And very usefully, it rounds up with God saying a bit more specifics about what's been going on. And he doesn't talk about whether it's Baal or any of the other gods or anything, but he does talk about sons and daughters being sacrificed in the fire. So that would certainly seem to marry up with what I've read elsewhere. The only problem is, of course, is the stuff I've read elsewhere that the source may have been the Bible, in which case it's somewhat circular and it's not particularly helpful. So that's something to keep an eye on, I think, in that we want to make sure that if we are using non-biblical sources of information to verify events, then they are actually independent of the Bible. They're not actually just referencing, because in the Bible it says that these people are being set fire to children and all the rest of it. But it's useful, I think, that it's finally actually mentioned in the Bible that, okay, that's what they're talking about in terms of these people being wicked. And like, yeah, give them a good hiding. That's pretty terrible, kind of as bad as it gets, really, I suppose, isn't it? So, yeah. Finally, there's one last little bit that we've had this before, but it's repeated, that people are not to add to or detract from the rules as they are given. It says, and you can't pick and choose. And that would then seem to tie into, well, a lot of these rules aren't adopted by Christians anymore, so clearly it lends weight to the argument that we know these are going to get replaced at some point, so we just need to find out how that happens. But yeah, that's Deuteronomy 8 to 12. Still difficult to spell, kind of hard to say, but I'm quite liking this. It's a very useful cross-reference in many ways, and it's very efficient in the sense that it's not saying a great deal, it's lots of little bits. So actually proving quite useful despite the fact it's repetition, and it is adding in quite a lot more context. So yeah, well, on the next one we'll carry on with a bit more of that.